Mom's mad because I won't take her other kids to dad's. He's done enough already. So yeah, my parents split when I was 16. I mean, I kind of saw it coming. You don't grow up in a house with constant yelling and think everything's going to be fine, you know? My mom, Sarah, was always bad with money. Like she thought buying expensive jewelry was somehow going to make her look like she had it together, even though we were barely scraping by. It was one of those things I didn't fully understand until later, but back then I just knew something was off. The divorce itself? A nightmare. My dad, Mark, found out my mom had been using credit cards he didn't even know existed. She'd maxed them out, just buying crap we didn't need. Jewelry, fancy clothes, even vacations she couldn't afford. He was furious, but what made it worse was that she wouldn't admit she had a problem. She acted like he was being unreasonable. Like, come on, how do you not see that blowing through all this money is a problem? It's not like we were rich or anything. After the divorce, things went from bad to worse. My dad got custody of me for a while, and honestly, it was a relief. I mean, living with my mom felt like living in chaos. We were bouncing from place to place, barely staying anywhere long enough to unpack our bags. She'd get us a new apartment, but by the time I got used to it, we'd be out the door because she missed rent again. It was like she couldn't handle the most basic adult stuff. I remember one time we moved into this place that was honestly kind of nice. It was in a decent part of town close to my school, and I thought, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe she's finally getting her act together. But nope. 3 months later, we're packing again because she spent all her money on some stupid bracelet and didn't have enough for rent. I can't tell you how many times I had to listen to her excuses. It's just a rough patch, she'd say, or things will get better soon. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Things never got better. When I was 9, she met Jake. He was, well, he seemed all right at first. He had 2 kids, Liam and Mia, and he seemed like a decent guy. But here's the thing. He was just as bad with money as she was. If you put 2 financially irresponsible people together, what do you think happens? Disaster. That's what happens. They spent like they were millionaires, and I knew that wasn't going to end well. I remember they had this huge wedding, like unnecessarily huge. They didn't even have enough money for groceries half the time, but somehow they scrounged up $10,000 for a wedding they couldn't afford. I was just a kid, but even I knew that was insane. They blew through that money like it was nothing. And guess what? They didn't even have any savings after. None. I overheard them arguing about it later, and Jake was like, I thought your parents were going to help out. And my mom was all, I thought your parents were going to help out. Like, seriously? How do 2 grown adults not talk about this stuff before they spend all that cash? My dad was keeping an eye on me through all of this. I'd go stay with him every now and then, and honestly, I always felt safer there. He had a good job, a stable home, and he wasn't blowing all his money on random stuff. It was such a different vibe from being with my mom and Jake. But even though I spent more time with my dad, my mom never stopped trying to drag him into her problems. Every once in a while, she'd call him up and ask for money. Not even for me, but for her and Jake. Like, hey Mark, we're in a bit of a rough spot, could you help us out? And my dad would shut it down every time. He wasn't about to get sucked back into her financial mess, and I didn't blame him. He'd done enough for her already. Things got worse when they had more kids. 2 more babies on top of Liam and Mia, and suddenly there were 5 kids in the house, including me. It was chaos. Absolute chaos. The babies were crying all the time. Liam and Mia were running wild, and my mom and Jake were constantly stressed about money. It didn't help that they couldn't stop spending. Like, I'm talking about late rent, bills piling up, and still finding money to go out to dinner. Who does that? It got so bad that my dad took me in full time again. I think he could tell I was getting overwhelmed, and honestly, I didn't want to be there either. It was like every day was just waiting for the next disaster. I felt guilty for leaving my siblings in that mess, but at the same time, I had to take care of myself too. I couldn't keep living in that chaos. One time, my mom even tried to get my dad to take Liam and Mia for the weekend. She was like, oh, they really miss you. They want to spend more time with you. He shut that down so fast. Sarah, they aren't my kids, he said. I'm not responsible for them. It sounds harsh, but he was right. My mom kept trying to push her problems onto him, and I wasn't going to let that happen. He had enough on his plate, dealing with her for all those years, and I wasn't about to let him get dragged back in just because Jake and her couldn't handle their own mess. By the time I turned 18, I was spending almost all my time with my dad. My mom hated it, and she'd guilt-trip me every chance she got. Your siblings need you, she'd say, or you're abandoning us. But I wasn't abandoning anyone. I just couldn't live like that anymore. Every time I went back to visit, it was the same thing. Bills unpaid, rent late, and my mom swearing she'd get her act together. She never did, though. I don't think she ever will. So things really started spiraling when Jake and my mom decided to have more kids. I remember thinking, you already have enough on your plate with Liam and Mia, and now you want to add more? But no one asked me what I thought. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. They didn't ask for anyone's opinion on anything, ever. They just did whatever they wanted and dealt with the consequences later. Well, dealt with is generous. They ignored the consequences until it was too late. So, they had their first kid together when I was about 13. I was living with my dad mostly by then, so I wasn't around all the time. But every weekend I'd be thrown back into the chaos of their house. And it was chaos. There was never enough of anything: food, space, patience. The baby, Emma, was always crying, and Liam and Mia were running wild like they had no rules at all. It was like Jake and my mom were so caught up in their own drama they forgot they had kids to take care of. It didn't help that Jake lost his job around that time. He was working as a mechanic, but I guess he got into some kind of fight with his boss and ended up getting fired. Instead of looking for another job right away, he just hung around the house all day sulking. My mom was working part-time at some retail store, but it wasn't enough to cover everything, so they fell behind on rent. Again. But what really blew my mind was how they'd act like everything was fine when I visited. Like they'd put on this front of being a happy family, but it was so fake, you could practically see through it. They'd try to do these forced family dinners where everyone would sit around the table like we were in some sitcom. Jake would crack lame jokes, and my mom would act like nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, the bills were piling up, and you could feel the tension hanging in the air like a thick cloud. And then, because they clearly hadn't learned their lesson the first time, they had another baby. Yep, just a year after Emma was born, Noah came along. Now there were 5 kids in the house. 5. And guess who got roped into helping out every time I was there? Me. It's like they thought, oh, she's older now, she can handle it. So I'd get stuck babysitting while they did who knows what, probably arguing about money, if I had to guess. It got to the point where I dreaded going over there. I'd tell my dad about it when I went back to his place, and he'd just shake his head. He didn't understand how they could keep digging themselves into a deeper hole. Honestly, neither did I. But it wasn't my mess to fix, you know? One time, I remember being over there for a weekend and everything was extra tense. Liam had just started middle school, and he was acting out a lot. Getting into fights at school, refusing to do his homework, the whole rebellious preteen thing. Mia was quieter, but she was always glued to her phone, ignoring everything going on around her. I tried talking to Liam about it once, but he just shrugged and said, "What's the point? No one cares what I do." That hit me hard. I mean, I knew things were bad, but hearing him say it so plainly made me realize just how much this mess was affecting them too. It wasn't just me feeling like I was stuck in the middle of a disaster. Liam and Mia were caught up in it just as much as I was, but they didn't have an escape. They didn't have my dad's house to go to when things got too crazy. They were stuck in that madhouse 24/7. I don't know if it was guilt or what, but after that, I started trying to be there for them more. I didn't want to, but I felt like I had to, you know? Like they didn't ask to be born into this mess any more than I did, and it's not their fault that their parents were, well, their parents. So I'd hang out with them when I could, play games with them, try to get them out of the house when things got too tense. But it didn't help much. The tension in that house was too thick to cut through with a few games of Monopoly. Jake and my mom were always either arguing or pretending everything was fine, and the kids were picking up on all of it. I could see it in how they acted. Mia got more withdrawn, and Liam's attitude just kept getting worse. Then one night, things really blew up. I was staying over for the weekend, and they were arguing again as usual. But this time, it was loud enough that all the kids heard. Liam came into my room, eyes wide, and asked, "Are they getting divorced?" I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to lie to him, but I also didn't want to freak him out more than he already was. So I just told him that I didn't know, and that no matter what happened, we'd figure it out. He didn't seem convinced. And honestly, neither was I. Turns out they weren't getting divorced. They were arguing about money again, and the stress of having 5 kids. Jake was threatening to leave, and my mom was crying, begging him to stay. It was a mess, and I felt like I was standing in the middle of it with no way out. I couldn't even escape to my dad's house because I was stuck there until Sunday night. The next day, I tried to act normal for the kids' sake. We went out to the park for a few hours just to get away from the house. Liam didn't say much, but Mia opened up a little. She told me how stressed out she was, how she felt like she had to be the good kid, so her parents wouldn't worry about her on top of everything else. That hit me hard too. Here was a 9-year-old kid trying to hold it together for her parents, when it should have been the other way around. That night, after I put the little ones to bed, I heard my mom on the phone. She was talking to my dad, and from what I could hear, She was trying to get him to take Liam and Mia for a few weeks. She was saying something about how they needed a break from the chaos and that it would be good for them to spend time with their other family. I remember thinking, what other family? My dad's not their dad. Why should he take care of them? It didn't make sense to me then, and it still doesn't. My dad wasn't responsible for cleaning up her mess, and neither was I. That's how things were for a long time. Chaotic, tense, and full of fake smiles and forced family dinners. I was just waiting for the next blow-up, the next argument, the next thing to go wrong. And honestly, I was just trying to survive it. Update 1. By the time I hit 18, I was pretty much living full-time at my dad's place. I mean, it wasn't like some big decision or anything. It just kind of happened naturally. My dad's house was calm, stable, two words that didn't exist in my mom's world. So I started spending more time at his place, and eventually I just stayed. Honestly, it was the best decision I ever made. But of course, nothing's ever that simple with my mom. So, one day out of nowhere, she calls me up, crying, like full-on sobbing. At first, I thought something terrible happened, like someone had died or something. But no, it was her usual drama. She was going on about how the kids missed me, how they needed me around more, and how everything was falling apart without me there to help out. I didn't even know what to say. I mean, she was acting like it was my job to fix her life. Like somehow me being there was going to magically solve all her problems. So I just kind of sat there, letting her ramble on, hoping she'd run out of steam eventually. But she didn't. She kept pushing, telling me how I was abandoning my family, how Liam and Mia were asking about me all the time, and how even Emma and Noah, who were toddlers at this point, were crying for me. It was a straight-up guilt trip. After a while, I finally cut in and said, "Mom, I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm just trying to live my life, and I can't do that with all the chaos over there." I tried to be as nice about it as I could, but honestly, I was fed up. I had spent enough time cleaning up her messes, and I wasn't about to let her drag me back into it. She didn't take it well. Her tone changed real quick. She went from crying to angry in a heartbeat. "You don't care about us anymore," she yelled. "You've turned into your father, always putting yourself first." That one stung. I mean, yeah, my dad had left her, but he didn't leave me. He was always there for me, and I wasn't about to let her twist that around like he was some kind of villain. I was about to say something back, but I caught myself. What was the point? She wasn't going to listen, and we'd just end up in another screaming match. Instead, I told her, "Look, I love you and the kids, but I can't keep coming over there and pretending everything's fine. It's not. You and Jake need to figure this out, and I can't be the one to fix it for you." That was the first time I'd really stood up to her like that. And let me tell you, it did not go over well. She hung up on me, which honestly was kind of a relief. I didn't want to deal with the aftermath of that conversation right then. But of course, it didn't end there. A few days later, my dad comes home from work, and he's got this weird look on his face. Turns out my mom had called him too, trying to guilt trip him into letting Liam and Mia come stay with us for a while. She was saying how they needed a break from all the tension, and how it would be good for them to spend some time with me and my dad. Now, my dad's a good guy, but he's no pushover. He's dealt with my mom's nonsense for years, and he wasn't about to get dragged back into it. He told her flat out, "They're not my responsibility, Sarah. I'm not going to take care of your kids. You need to figure this out on your own." When he told me about the conversation, I could tell he felt bad about it. My dad's the type of guy who hates seeing people suffer, but even he had his limits. And honestly, I didn't blame him. He'd done more than enough to help my mom over the years, and it wasn't fair for her to keep trying to pull him into her mess. After that, my mom started trying other ways to get to me. She'd send Liam or Mia to call me, knowing I'd have a harder time saying no to them. I mean, it's tough when you've got your 12-year-old brother on the phone saying, "When are you coming over? We miss you." It messed with my head a bit, honestly. I knew it wasn't his fault, but it felt like my mom was using him to manipulate me. And then, to make matters worse, she started dropping hints that Jake was thinking about leaving. Now, I wasn't Jake's biggest fan by any means, but the idea of him leaving the kids behind made me feel sick. I couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if he actually bailed. My mom couldn't handle things on her own. I'd seen what life was like when she was single, and it was not good. The thought of her raising 5 kids by herself was a nightmare. But here's the thing. No matter how much I wanted to help, I knew deep down that it wasn't my responsibility. I couldn't keep putting my own life on hold to fix theirs. So I did what I always did. I tried to set boundaries. The next time Liam called, I explained to him that I couldn't come over as often anymore. I told him I was busy with school and work, which wasn't a lie, I really was. But I made sure to tell him that I loved him, and that I'd still come visit when I could. He seemed to understand, but I could hear the disappointment in his voice. That's what made it so hard. But even with all that, my mom wouldn't let up. She kept calling, kept sending the kids to guilt trip me, kept trying to drag me back into the chaos. It was like she couldn't function without me there to hold things together. Then one night, I was at my dad's place, and my phone started blowing up with texts from Mia. She was begging me to come over, saying that things were really bad and that she didn't know what to do. My heart sank. I couldn't ignore it, so I called her right away. She picked up the phone, sobbing, and told me that Jake had stormed out after another huge fight with my mom. He'd been drinking, which wasn't new, and he said he wasn't coming back. She was scared and didn't know what to do. I told her to hang tight and that I'd be there as soon as I could. I didn't even think twice. I just grabbed my stuff and headed out the door. When I got there, the house was a mess, like literally and figuratively. My mom was in her room, crying, and the kids were all huddled together in the living room, looking lost. It was in that moment that I realized just how bad things had gotten. They weren't just dysfunctional, they were broken. And no matter how much I wanted to fix it, I couldn't. Not by myself, anyway. That night, I stayed with the kids, trying to keep them calm. But I knew that this wasn't sustainable. I couldn't keep playing the role of the responsible adult in a house full of people who refuse to act like adults themselves. Update 2. So after that night where Jake stormed out, things didn't magically get better. I wasn't really expecting them to, but there was a part of me that hoped maybe it'd be a wake-up call for my mom. She needed to get her life together. 2 days later, Jake came back. I wasn't there when it happened, but Mia told me about it. Apparently, my mom just let him back in like nothing had happened. No questions, no consequences. It was like he hadn't even threatened to leave them all just a few nights before. I couldn't believe it, but at the same time, I wasn't surprised. That's how things worked in their world. Brush everything under the rug and pretend like everything's fine. But the thing that really messed me up was what happened next. I was at my dad's house after the whole mess when I get a call from my mom. She sounded weirdly calm, which instantly put me on edge because calm and my mom didn't really go together. She was like, I didn't want to, but I could say. When I got there, she was sitting at the kitchen table looking, well, looking tired. Like not just physically tired, but emotionally drained. I could tell she had something big to say, but I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. Then she just came right out with it. I'm pregnant. I literally just, she'd just said, pregnant, again, to feed. Another baby to raise in a house that was already falling apart. I didn't even know how to respond. All I could manage was, how? She looked at me like I was dumb for asking. But seriously, I couldn't wrap my head around it. They could barely take care of the 5 kids they already had, and now they were bringing another one into the mix? It didn't make any sense. She said, which was the said something that really threw me. I need you to help out more. That's when I lost it. Are you serious right now? I practically yelled. You can't even handle the kids you have, and now you're asking me to step in and take care of another one? She looked hurt, but I didn't care at that point. I was angry. I was angry because she was just making things worse and expecting me to pick up the pieces. It wasn't fair. It wasn't my responsibility. I can't do this anymore, Mom, I said, my voice shaking. It's fine when it's not. You need to fix. She didn't say anything for a long time, and I could see she was trying to hold back tears. But honestly, I didn't feel bad. I felt guilty for not feeling bad, but at the same time, I knew that I couldn't keep living like this. It wasn't healthy for me, and it wasn't going to fix anything. After a long, awkward silence, she finally said, I'll figure it out. I didn't believe her, but I didn't argue either. What was the point? I just nodded and left. When I got back to my dad's, I didn't even know how to explain what had just happened. How do you tell someone that your mom is having another kid when she can't even handle the ones she has? It was all too much. A few weeks passed, and I tried to distance myself. I still visited the kids, but I made it clear to my mom that I wasn't going to be her backup plan. I had my own life to live, and I couldn't keep putting it on hold for her. Things were quiet for a while, but I should have known it wouldn't last. One evening, I got a text from Mia. It wasn't a long message, just a few words that hit me like a brick. Jake's gone. I called her immediately, and she told me that he had packed up his stuff and left. No warning, no explanation. He just left. I could hear the fear in her voice, and it broke my heart. As much as I didn't like Jake, the kids didn't deserve this. They were just innocent bystanders in all of it. I rushed over there, and when I walked into the house, it felt like I had walked into a funeral. My mom was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the wall, while the kids were scattered around the room, all of them looking lost. Liam was pacing, Mia was crying, and the little ones were clinging to each other, not really understanding what was going on. My mom didn't even acknowledge me when I walked in. She just sat there like she was in shock. I didn't know what to do. I mean, what do you even say in a situation like that? So I went to the kids and tried to comfort them as best as I could. But inside, I was freaking out. What were they going to do? What was I going to do? That night, I stayed over with the kids. My mom barely moved from the couch the whole time, and Jake didn't come back. The next morning, I made breakfast for everyone and tried to keep things as normal as possible for the little ones. But the whole time, I was thinking, how the hell did we get here? After breakfast, I sat down with my mom trying to figure out what the plan was. But she didn't have one. She didn't have a clue what to do. Jake was gone, and she was left to deal with the fallout. And on top of that, she was still pregnant with another kid. I couldn't help but feel a wave of anger wash over me. How had it gotten this bad? How had she let it get this bad? I didn't have answers, and neither did she. Update 3. So after Jake left, things just kept getting worse, which honestly, I didn't think was possible at that point. My mom was a wreck, and the house was basically falling apart around her. The kids were all over the place, and I was trying to be there as much as I could, but it was draining. Every time I walked into that house, it felt like a weight dropped on my chest. The place was a mess, bills were piling up, and the kids were looking at me like I had all the answers. But the truth is, I didn't. I had no clue what to do anymore. I tried to keep some normalcy for them. I'd help with homework, make dinner, even clean the house when it got too unbearable. But it didn't feel like enough. Nothing did. My mom was barely functioning, and with the baby on the way, I knew things were going to get even more chaotic. Part of me felt like I should step in more, but another part of me knew that wasn't fair. I had my own life. I wasn't their parent. I wasn't even living there full time. But still, the guilt was eating me alive. The breaking point came about 2 months after Jake left. I was over at the house, helping Liam with some school project when my mom came out of her room looking worse than I'd ever seen her. She sat down at the kitchen table and just stared at me for a while. I didn't know what she was going to say, but I could feel something big was coming. Then she dropped it. I'm going to lose the house. I didn't know what to say. I mean, I knew things were bad, but I didn't realize they were that bad. She hadn't been paying the mortgage since Jake left, and now they were threatening to take the house away. I asked her what she was going to do, and she just shrugged. I don't know, she said. I was hoping you could help. That's when I knew I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep letting her drag me down with her. I had been trying to help for years, and things had only gotten worse. I realized that no matter how much I did, it was never going to be enough because she wasn't willing to take responsibility for her own life. I took a deep breath and said, Mom, I can't keep fixing this for you. She looked at me confused. What do you mean? I mean, I can't keep coming over here, cleaning up the mess and pretending everything's okay, I said. You need to figure this out on your own. I'll help with the kids, but I'm not going to fix your financial problems. I'm not going to save this house. I could tell she didn't want to hear it. She started crying, saying how she didn't know what to do, how she was scared, how she couldn't do this without me. And yeah, that hit me hard. It's tough hearing your own mom say stuff like that. But at the same time, I knew this was the right thing to do. I had to draw the line somewhere, and this was it. I'll help as much as I can, I told her. But I'm not a bank and I'm not a parent. You've got to take control of your life. She didn't say much after that. Just sat there, wiping away her tears, looking completely defeated. I felt like crap, but I knew it had to be done. If I didn't set boundaries now, she was going to keep leaning on me forever, and I couldn't live like that. After that conversation, things got a little weird between us. My mom didn't call me as much, and when she did, it was short and to the point. No more guilt trips, no more asking for money. I could tell she was upset, but at least she was starting to realize I wasn't going to be her safety net anymore. I still went over to help with the kids. I wasn't going to abandon them. They needed me, and it wasn't their fault their parents were a mess. But even that was getting harder. Every time I went over, it felt like the house was falling apart a little more. The lights would flicker, the fridge was always half empty, and the stress in the air was so thick you could practically feel it. I started worrying about the kids more and more, wondering what was going to happen if they really lost the house. One night, Mia pulled me aside and asked me straight up, "Are we going to be homeless?" I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but I didn't want to lie either. So I just said, "We're going to figure something out, I promise." I hated giving her such a vague answer. But what else could I say? I wasn't even sure what the future looked like anymore. A few weeks later, things took another turn. My mom called me and said she was going to move in with Jake's parents. Apparently, they were willing to take her and the kids in for a while until she got back on her feet. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Jake's parents weren't exactly the most reliable people, but at least it was a roof over their heads. It was better than nothing. But here's the kicker. I know you said not to use that phrase, but it just fits here. She wanted me to move in with them too. She said they had space for me, that it would be just like old times. I couldn't believe she was asking me that. After everything that had happened, after all the boundaries I tried to set, she still thought I was going to just slide back into the chaos. I told her no, it wasn't even a hard decision. I wasn't going to let her pull me back into that mess. I had my own life to live, and I wasn't about to sacrifice that to fix her mistakes. She wasn't happy about it, but this time, I didn't feel guilty. I knew I was doing the right thing for myself. The last time I went to their house before they moved out, it felt weird, like the end of an era. The house was mostly packed up, and there were boxes everywhere. The kids were running around, excited about moving to their grandparents' place, which was a relief. I was worried they'd be scared or upset, but they seemed to be handling it okay. Before I left, my mom pulled me aside and gave me a hug. It was the first real moment of connection we'd had in a long time. She didn't say much, just, "I'm sorry." I didn't really know what she was apologizing for, maybe for everything, maybe for nothing, but it felt like a small step in the right direction. I hugged her back and said, "I'm always here for you, Mom, but you have to take care of yourself." And with that, I left. I didn't look back. I knew I'd done everything I could.